Good evening from Mexico City. More than 34,000 Mexicans have been killed in this country as part of the U.S.-backed war against drug traffickers. And the drug cartels have now expanded their reach from beyond the borders into almost all parts of the country, even some here in the center, Mexico City. We came here to get the pulse of the drug war and found a sense that what is being tried now isn't working. Anxiety is high, and many are saying that it's time for a radical rethink. Tonight, we will examine this crisis in depth and from several perspectives, hearing from those struggling to understand and forge policy on the front lines. The United States and Mexico have a long, uneasy relationship rooted in disputes over territory, immigration, and the trafficking of arms and illegal drugs across the border. But the 2006 election of Mexican President Felipe Calderón signaled a new cooperation. President Calderón immediately deployed his nation's military against the drug gangs that in recent years had grown into vicious criminal organizations. And the United States offered the Mexican president unprecedented support in the form of arms, intelligence, and training. To date, Washington has pledged $1.4 billion to Mexico's drug war. But while the United States was publicly backing the Mexican efforts in private, there were grave concerns. Internal cables from the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, released by WikiLeaks, painted the Mexican military as disorganized and not up to the job. It was an embarrassment to President Calderón and his counter-narcotic strategy. Then, in early 2011, a U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officer was killed while stationed in Mexico by suspected drug traffickers. President Calderón rushed to Washington in March to meet with President Obama and made a strong public case for maintaining the U.S.-Mexican partnership.
The United States and Mexico are walking towards an uncertain future together, and the more we cooperate, the more we can build secure and prosperous lives for our peoples, both sides of the border.
We arrived in Mexico shortly after that speech and found that some of President Calderón's former supporters were losing patience with his policies.
It is easier to get a good Secretary of State, honestly.
Dr. Jorge Castañeda is one of Mexico's best-known public thinkers. He served as foreign minister for the last Mexican president, Vicente Fox, and he campaigned tirelessly for Calderón in an extremely tight presidential race. But since then, Dr. Castañeda has become one of Calderón's toughest critics, primarily of the president's war on drug trafficking. And he thinks now is the time to do away with the war on drugs with a radical new policy.
I'm totally in favor of legalization of drugs in general and marijuana in particular.
You know, there are people who are watching and listening to this and say, ooh, then rather than interviewing a very radical guy down there in Mexico, he's got all these radical proposals. Do you see them that way?
Well, legalization of drugs doesn't seem to me to be a terribly radical proposal. 47% of the people of California voted for it in terms of marijuana just 4 months ago. Republican conservative like George Shultz and mega financiers like George Soros are in favor of it.
But that's for marijuana, not for the hard drug.
Yes. No, we can start with marijuana. Even the U.S. Embassy here says that they estimate, and the DEA uses this estimate, it may be a little exaggerated, that 60% of the profits of the Mexican cartels come from marijuana. Let's say it's not 50, let's say it's 40. Solving 40% of any problem these days is not bad.
What do you make of the proposals to say, listen, what we need to do is cut the production of marijuana? There was a time when Mexico was a transit place, but now a lot of marijuana is grown here. They're going to farmers and say, instead of growing marijuana, we'll help you plant an orchard or something.
Well, if that had worked somewhere in the world, then I would be, quite willing to consider it here. Alternative crop programs in Bolivia, in Peru, in Afghanistan have not worked. and they haven't worked for the past 40, 50 years. Why? Because you'll never give a peasant the rent, the extraordinary rent on growing illegal drugs by growing, tulips. It's not going to happen.
How can you get at, how can Mexico get at the drug organizations, or can they?
I don't really know how they can. I'm not sure that's possible. I'm not sure it's necessarily desirable in the sense that if it's not possible, what you want to do is set yourself goals that you can achieve. Now, what is it, if you look at the polls and you ask Mexicans, are they worried about drug trafficking? No. Are they worried about drug consumption in Mexico? No. Are they worried about kidnapping, violence? Yes. Okay, so what you want to do is attack those aspects of the violence and insecurity, the collateral damages. You want to stop kidnapping. You want to stop extortion, protection rackets, which are really terribly damaging to small, mid-sized communities. You want to stop automobile theft. You want to stop people, homes being held up. That's what people are worried about in this country. Now, when someone says, well, it's the drug traffickers who do that, well, go after the kidnapper. If he happens to be a drug trafficker also, great, you got a twofer. Fine.
Well, both President Bush and President Obama have supported the, quote, war on drugs in Mexico.
They have and they haven't. In other words, they have in the sense that they have been very generous in their rhetorical support, both Bush and Obama, for President Calderon. Every time they see him, they pat him on the back and they say, you're doing great, you're brave, courageous, bold, etc. Neither President Bush nor Obama have really done anything about either U.S. consumption or U.S. arms exports to Mexico. So it's obvious that American society doesn't want to reduce consumption. It feels it's doing just fine the way it is. So why in the world would American presidents declare a war on drugs in Chicago or Los Angeles or New York or Birmingham or anywhere else? They don't want to. What's incomprehensible to me is why we should do it if Americans don't want to. And by the way, I insist, I agree Americans shouldn't. But go after the kidnapper. Let the other guys, I wouldn't say allow them to do what they do, but understand that you're not going to stop it. What is the U.S., what are U.S. armed forces, 130,000 of them, doing with poppy growers and heroin labs in Afghanistan? They're looking the other way because they have another battle to wage against the Taliban. So why should we act differently?
List for me 1, 2, 3, your top 3 things you think the United States could be doing and should be doing to help the situation in Mexico, particularly directed toward the violence brought on by the drug trade.
Well, if I may, I try and turn it around. In the sense, I think the best thing the United States could do for all of these problems to be eventually solved is to contribute actively to building a more modern, more democratic, more prosperous, more secure Mexico. And that has a lot of implications. It's not just police work. It is more trade. It means dealing with the immigration question and settling the issue of 6 to 7 million Mexicans illegally in the United States. Give them legal status, let them work, let them become residents, let them eventually become American citizens, and allow for more Mexicans to enter the United States, but not illegally, legally. The only way to solve the issue of illegal immigration is to make it legal, not to stop it. It's not going to stop. It never has. It's been going on for more than a century. It's not going to stop. Contribute more to the type of supranational institutions with Canada that the Europeans have built over the past 50 years.
You're talking about Canada, United States, Mexico,
common
much
market,
improved common market, trade zone.
Absolutely. A common external tariff, some institutions, social cohesion funds, etc. Americans say, well, yeah, we're not in the business of spending money for other countries. We don't like that. Like Iraq? How much has the U.S. spent in Iraq the last 8 years?
Trillions of dollars.
10 billion, 5 billion a year in Mexico makes all the difference in the world. It's peanuts compared to Iraq or Afghanistan, and this is enormously more important for the United States than Iraq or Afghanistan.
Why do you think a succession of United States presidents have paid so little attention to Mexico?
Because they take Mexico for granted. And they've been right. In other words, the U.S. should count its blessings, because not only has it had a neighbor at peace with the United States, it has had a neighbor at peace with itself since 1920, let's say, when the revolution ended, 1917 if you prefer. This is quite a luxury. Ask the French, ask India, ask the Chinese, ask the Germans. And this is quite a luxury. So that's one good reason. Another good reason that Americans tend to take Mexico for granted is that Mexico is a very hospitable place for Americans. 1 million Americans live here the whole year round. 20 million Americans visit Mexico every year, not just crossing the border, spending at least a night somewhere in the interior. It's an enormous amount of people. There's no incidents worth mentioning.
I want to talk about the WikiLeaks case. WikiLeaks published these cables from U.S. diplomats, and they described the Mexican military as disorganized and incompetent in its war on drug trafficking. It was pretty critical all the way around in the WikiLeaks. How accurate is the assessment? Whether one likes the fact it was leaked or not, how accurate is it?
Well, just a tiny little bit of context. Mexico put together its current army back in the late 20s, early 30s. And ever since then, it was purposefully kept in a state of limited resources, limited training, limited capability. I mean, we really nickeled and dimed them in every sense of the word, in every aspect of military activity. And we did that deliberately, as a policy, as a national, long-standing policy. Why? Because we didn't want them to even think of trying to take power. And in a region, Latin America, where armies take power or took power all the time,
with coups and
coups all the time. Central America, South America, democratic countries like Chile, like Uruguay, undemocratic countries, the works. This was a very intelligent, very far-sighted, very visionary policy that the Mexican system, in its wisdom, adopted back in the 30s. Then you take these guys and you tell them overnight, okay guys, now we got to go to war. Time to fight.
Wasn't an army constituted to go to war?
Of course not. It's constituted for natural disasters, for earthquakes and stuff. They just tell them, okay guys, now we go to war. There's these guys out there, they have machine guns, they have surface-to-air missiles, they have automatic weapons, they're well-trained, they're desperate, they're ruthless. Go and get them, guys. They have no idea how to do this. Now, maybe that previous decision was wrong. Or maybe it became wrong, it became obsolescent with time. That may be. But what you can't do, I think, is take that army and overnight send it to war.
In your opinion, based on your experience and knowledge of the country, where will Mexico be 10 years from now? Will it still have this savage drug business?
I don't think so, for two reasons. First, because I think the next government will back off from this. President Calderon can't anymore, but I think the next government, whoever it is, will back off one way or another, explicitly or discreetly, tacitly. This can't go on.
You mean go more toward law enforcement rather than military war?
More law enforcement, less army, more tolerance, less obsession, more silence, less grandstanding, less stridency, firstly. Secondly, I think that Mexico 10 years from now will be a very prosperous country. If you look at the change in Mexico over the past 10 years and just extrapolate that same change for the next 10 years, this will be a prosperous, democratic, middle-class society where millions of foreigners come and live, where Mexicans find good jobs, higher-paying jobs, with stable institutions, and maybe where one of the economic activities that people have here is growing and exporting marijuana to the United States.
Doctor, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adler. It's an honor.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.